Welcome to the Water Resources East Joint Water Company Drought Planning webinar. My name is Ben Fitzsimons. I'm the Technical Director at Water Resources East, and I'll be chairing today's session, but you'll be hearing primarily from key reps and leads of drought planning, drought plan developments at the water company members across the Water Resources East region. Just to get us started, a bit of housekeeping. Hopefully you're all finding the sound and the slide display okay, but microphones are all set off. Just check that that's the case, just to make sure that there's no background noise. If there are any issues, you can raise your hand, and Alice on the call will help us address any technical issues. The Teams chat, the regular Teams chat, can be used for technical and general comments and general issues, sound or slides, whatever it might be. But we do have the Q&A function enabled. So hopefully at the top of your Teams menu, you'll see the Q&A button. Within that, you'll be able to type free type questions for the speakers that we can take collectively at the end, and we'll all be monitoring that. The speakers will be monitoring that during the session and hopefully be primed, ready to answer and discuss areas of interest. And also, for your information, the session is already being recorded. The recording's already started, so hopefully that is okay with you. And the webinar will be published. A recording of it will be published on the Water Resources East website shortly after the day. So the session's running through. We've got until 12 o'clock, 12 noon, to give space for discussion and other questions as necessary. But we've got the agenda actually takes us up to 11:30. So hopefully we've got plenty of space for that discussion as needed. So I'll give us a brief introduction as to why we're here in just a second, and then you'll hopefully have a lot of interesting presentations from the people listed there representing the water companies in the region, and they'll take you each through from their company perspective the situation, the water resources and drought planning situation within their patch, and some of the areas that they'll be focusing on over the coming year or so in the update of drought plans. So why are we here, and why is Water Resources East hosting this webinar? Well, you may more frequently come across Water Resources East in our work around long-term water resources planning. But sitting alongside that is drought planning. It's very much it's a different beast. And so we felt that it was worth having a dedicated session for our wider stakeholder group to offer an opportunity for water companies who manage water supply droughts to explain the situation there, explain the work that they do, and explain some of the thinking that they're going to be going through as we go through the next few months in the update to their drought plans 2027. This webinar coincides with a kind of a pre-consultation period on those drought plans 2027. A couple of those are already concluded, a couple of are about to conclude, but the water company reps that you'll be hearing from today are really happy and open to hear further feedback at any time as we go through the period immediately following this, or more formally when the consultation gets released in the winter time. And people on the call here, the speakers, will give you a bit more intel on that. But just before we embark on the nitty gritty of water supply drought planning and what it means for the water companies in the Water Resources East region, we just want to check that we're all on the same page with some terminology and make sure we all understand where we're coming from at this. So what we're going to be focusing on today is the drought planning from a water company perspective, and that's what we're terming a water supply drought. And that's when a long-term shortage of rainfall, and for the east of England, that would typically end up being a multi-year period of dry weather, where our aquifers and our winter storage reservoirs are reaching a state of relative depletion. That's causing water companies an element of concern about how their supplies can be managed to their customer base. And this type of drought takes longer to develop, and it's more or less because water companies nationally and within the East have developed very high levels of resilience to dry weather. Now, that's in contrast to what we might refer to as an environmental drought, or in some cases an agricultural drought. And these droughts can emerge over much shorter time frames. So from an environmental drought perspective, for example, in 2018, this can occur when a shortage of rainfall is seen to be having a detrimental impact on the environment. And the signs of this can be stress for wildlife, fish, and water-dependent habitats. And from an agricultural perspective, an agricultural drought, there was an example of that also in 2018. This happens when there's an insufficient amount of rainfall and soil moisture to support crop production or farming practices in general, or irrigation. And this can often coincide with an environmental drought or a water supply drought, but not always. These things can develop much quicker depending on the level of resilience that individual businesses and farming areas have built up. And the other thing just to check on is the contrast between the water supply drought, as described, when raw water storage levels like winter storage reservoirs, the large stores of water we have in the region, are running low and abstraction from the environment is limited, versus periods of simply peak demand. And this is where the water supply network may be under a little bit of increased pressure, and the capacity in the system is just hindering alongside that peak in demand to process and output the water quickly enough to supply customers and meet that peak demand. So hopefully just have in mind those different terms and definitions as we work through. So just reflecting on how we've arrived here today in some previous droughts before I hand over to the water company reps. We often talk about the 1976 drought and the standpipes, and really it's the impact of that changed the way we manage droughts in England as a whole, and how we began to develop much greater levels of resilience to these severe droughts. And increasingly, we're planning for more and more severe droughts through both drought planning actions and the triggers that are triggering actions there, and in water resource management plans. And there have been numerous notable droughts. They're listed at the bottom of the slide there. I won't run through them in detail, but it's the learnings from those droughts that are getting taken into the updates to the drought plans each time they're reiterated. And reflecting back on 2022-23 drought, which followed or developed as a result of 6 consecutive months of below average rainfall between March and August, and combined with the hottest summer on record, the impacts that were felt across water companies and other water dependent users and environments has really played into some of the thinking and the areas that the water companies will be focusing on and talking to you about today as they update their drought plans over the next 18 months or so. So with that said, I am going to be handing over to Liz Corbett, representing Northumbrian Water / Essex and Suffolk Water when it comes to the WRE region, to talk you through what it is that a drought plan is intended to do. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Ben. So what is a drought plan? It's a statutory regulatory requirement for all water companies and NAVs to produce a drought plan every 5 years. So a NAV stands for new appointee or variation. It's essentially a small private water supply company. You often find them where you get large new housing estates built, and you'll get a company set up that provides all the utilities for that area. So that's a NAV. So they need to produce a drought plan now as well. That's a statutory requirement for them. So every 5 years we produce what's called a water resources management plan, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. So we alternate between the water resources management plan and then the drought plan. We've just published or in the process of publishing water resource management plans, and so we're moving on to update our drought plans. The drought plan presents how we propose to manage our water resources during a drought. To maintain public water supplies, and also importantly to protect the environment as well. So when I say water resources, it could be rivers, reservoirs, lakes and groundwater sources, as well as any other novel sources of water that we're looking at in the future now, such as effluent reuse and types of things like that. We produce these plans in alignment with Department for Food and Rural Affairs directions, and the Environment Agency provide guidance around what should be included in our plans. In the context of Anglian region in the east of England, we are in a water stressed area, and it's particularly important for us to prepare for droughts because of the low rainfall we experience in this area. So to ensure that we are prepared for drought, we have to consider current and future pressures from climate change particularly, and also growth in domestic customer demand, and also non-household demand from industry and commercial enterprises. The future climate change predictions in the Thriving East and FENS climate change risk assessment reports, which was a study undertaken by the University of East Anglia in Norwich in association with Anglian Water and some other collaborative organisations, assessed that our region will be hotter than the national average in future. Rainfall will be significantly below the average rainfall, which it already is, but it will exacerbate under climate change, and droughts are predicted to persist for longer. So we are particularly prone to droughts in the area and therefore must plan accordingly and rigorously. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an idea of how our drought plans fit in with the other plans. I've mentioned water resources management plan. We also have something called an emergency plan as well. So the table on the right here shows you how these interact. So our water resource management plan is a long-term strategic plan. So we look at 25 years or more into the future, and we work out if we have sufficient supplies available to us in quite a severe drought, so something of a 1 in 500 year return period. So that's an average frequency of that severity of drought occurring. So in our recent plans that the companies have either published already or about to publish, we are planning to a 1 in 500 year return period severity drought by 2040. And our WMP set out how we'll adapt to the climate change we're experiencing now and also future climate change as well, and the impacts on our water resources. Those plans also incorporate population growth and the growth in industry demand, and importantly set out how we will protect the environment, in some cases leaving more water in the environment so that it is resilient to climate change. In our WMPs, we include our planned demand management strategies, so leakage reduction, how we support our customers to use water wisely and efficiently, and how we reduce leakage. I've mentioned that one. Metering and metering strategies, so looking at the number of meters where we'll install them, smart metering programs. And as I mentioned, they are either published on the company websites or very soon to be published. So our WMPs, they cover the first stages of drought, and where those resources will be coming from. However, the drought plan is slightly different. It's more of a tactical plan. So we'll have in there all of the actions that we'll undertake in a drought, how those are triggered during a drought, and how more of the detail about how we would undergo the various permits or demand reductions, things like communications plan around how we might talk to customers, communicate with different parts of our customer base around using water wisely through the different stages of drought. And then the step on from that is water company emergency plans. So these are looking at very severe droughts, so what's called level 4 drought actions. So the company emergency plans aren't in the public domain due to security and sensitivity reasons, but they will be covering things like standpipes and pressure reductions, rotor cuts, for example. So very severe drought actions. Our drought plans will align with our WMP 24, so they're, as I say, published or about to be published. And the drought plans will follow on from those with regards to things like levels of service. So levels of service are our planned and expected frequencies of when we might need to implement various drought actions. So for example, level 1 drought actions from the demand perspective are asking our customers to use water very efficiently and wisely, and a little bit more communication than we would give during a normal summer, for example. And our levels of service is the frequency at which we expect to have to ask our customers to use water wisely. And then the next step would be level 2, which is a temporary use ban. So that used to be known as a hose pipe ban. So our drought plans will align with those levels of service set out in our WMPs. And as I said, drought plans are tactical plans, and they set out the specific actions where we will reduce demand or increase supplies in a drought with our current resources and assets that we have available to us to date. A large part of the drought plan is also looking at identifying, monitoring, mitigating and recovering from any environmental impacts that might come from our drought actions. So the environmental assessment part of the drought plans is a key aspect as well. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thank you, Liz. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Dan Hawkins, Senior Drought Leader at Anglian Water. I'm going to talk a bit about what's included within the drought plan, what legislation and guidance is, and then also what the current timelines are for this current round of drought planning. So as Liz mentioned, quite a lot of the things are already included within the drought plan. This is kind of how we set up a drought plan itself. So on the left-hand side are some suggested sections that we would have within all of our drought plans. Kind of mainly telling us about the drought monitoring, the drought actions, and then how we would communicate. So as you can see on the right-hand side, there is a table which sets out the levels that Liz mentioned, the kind of drought statuses that accompany that, and then potential kind of associated actions that we might put against each one of those levels. But how do we know that we're at a certain drought level? Well, that's all through the drought monitoring and the triggers that we apply to our sources. So drought monitoring might be through indicators from river flows to reservoir levels to groundwater levels. And then it might also be through precipitation or soil moisture deficit, i.e. how dry are the soils. That then tells us within each of our water resource zones what level we may be at, and then our drought plan sets out the actions that we would implement or we may implement against that level to ensure we kind of mitigate the impact of drought to your public water supply. So as you can see, the actions get severe, kind of the severity of the actions increases as you go down the scale. Through the kind of the normal actions that we'd have in general, from the BAU demand management actions and kind of optimizing the system, through to level 1, where there's voluntary communication campaigns, us looking at our leakage control and leakage management within certain areas, and then implementing things like supply actions that will, with minor environmental impacts, transferring water around, reducing outage, etc. That then moves through to level 2, and that's where some restrictions could come in. So temporary use bans, like Liz mentioned, the hosepipe bans, kind of further work on our side from managing the system, potentially applying for drought permits that would allow us to take a bit more water from the environment. So with minor environmental impacts, and then all the way through to the end of kind of that drought period there, which would be level 3A, which could be further restrictions on the hosepipe ban, but then also non-essential use drought orders, which would impact business customers as well as domestic customers. Then you kind of go through to the kind of the level 3B, which is before that emergency plan that Liz mentioned at level 4. And the 3B was kind of termed as extreme actions. So this is kind of all of the actions that we can do to stop us from getting to those emergency orders, such as rota cuts, which obviously are deemed unacceptable in this day and age. So that's kind of how we go through the process of actions, and that's how our plan kind of sets out kind of what they may be within our region. And then we have a communications plan, like Liz said, and this is really important because communicating with customers, both with our employees within the company, but customers that use the water as well, it's important to take them along on that journey to understand where we're currently at from a water source situation, what we're doing, what we need help with, just so that everyone's aware of what the situation is, so we can work together to mitigate the impact if and when it occurs. We also have to talk about recovery and end of drought. So when do we know that we're recovering? When do we know it's the end of drought? We've got to make sure that we're monitoring that and mitigating any impacts, like Liz says. And also the drought plan itself sets out a drought management structure. So how as companies, we kind of set up a structure internally to manage the situation and implement the actions that need to be implemented. Alongside the main plan, there's a number of appendices. So as Liz said, the environmental assessments are there for us. We have to make sure that we assess any impacts that may have an environmental impact. There's also a customer and stakeholder summary that we all create, which is a more summarized version of the main plan for customers and stakeholders to understand our drought planning process. And there may also be technical appendices which explain how we develop some of those triggers and actions that are mentioned above. Next slide, please, Alice. So how are we governed and how is this put forward? So I've listed some of the legislation here, but this is kind of not all of them. But the key ones are the Water Industry Act, the Water Resources Act, which sets out what we have to do as a water company, the Drought Plan regulations, which talk a bit more about the restrictions and how we have to operate during drought. The Water Use Temporary Bans Order, that's all about the kind of the restrictions and the exceptions that are included within temporary usage bans and non-essential usage bans. And the drought direction, which is due to be with us in the next few weeks. That is the government expectations and governance for this round of drought planning. What are they expecting us as water companies to create? And then the guidance, as Liz mentioned, so that basically every drought planning cycle, the Environment Agency set out what their expectations are and what we need to be included within our plans. And there's supplementary guidance as well on the more detailed elements such as drought permits and environmental assessments. And the EA have updated this guidance for this round of drought plans, and that is available online. The consultation on this has closed, but you can still view that document through that link, which we'll share after this webinar. And that gives an idea of the draft guidance that will, I think, due to be published in sometime in March. Next slide, please. So how does that look on a timeline? So we're in the process as water companies of drafting our plans. As Liz mentioned, a few of us have been part of the kind of set out a pre-consultation where we shared kind of with the stakeholders what we're planning to do, and we're also going to do that within this meeting as well. Most of those have closed. I think Essex and Suffolk closes at the end of this week, but we're still happy to receive comments or suggestions of what we need to be aiming for. So we're still working through that draft plan, and that we've just got the deadline for the submission actually, which is Monday the 6th of October. So we're working through to that point. Then, as you can see here, the DEFRA just do a bit of security check on those plans just to make sure they're available to be published. And then we would publish those draft plans online to everyone to see, and they can review and feedback on those. And that is likely to be between November and January 2026. We then take all of those comments, we review them, we create a statement of response, how we've addressed those comments, and we might create a revised draft plan how we've addressed those comments in practice in a newer updated plan, and that would be due for submission by time in April 2026. That would then go through a kind of a regulator review and another security check as well before potentially publishing our final plan towards the autumn or winter of 2026. So currently working through the draft plan process at the moment. So I think we're now going to hand over to the kind of focus areas of where the water companies are aiming for. And I think Annika is going to take over here.
Hi, thanks, Dan. Yes, I'm Annika Lannan, and I am the drought lead for Affinity Water. So this first slide we've put together just to avoid some repetition of going through what we're all doing as part of this new drought planning process. So some common focus areas that we are typically focusing on as an industry. A lot of these changes have been set out in the new drought plan guidance, which has been put together by the Environment Agency, as Dan mentioned, and which they've updated and are due to publish soon. So the first of those is that we are taking on board lessons learned from the drought event in 2022, which many water companies went through, which helped to inform what went well, what didn't go so well through following our drought plans. And as part of that, a new drought code of practice was also published following that drought event, and we are taking on board the lessons that are set out in that drought code of practice to ensure we're all following best practice. We are all reviewing the drought triggers set out in our drought plans. Dan went through these as well with those different colours ranging from drought trigger 1 through to 4, which is effectively the emergency level, and using latest knowledge both gained from 2022 and any information we have from updating any modelling we carry out around drought severities, and ensuring that those levels are set at appropriate appropriate points, whether that be for groundwater levels or surface water levels, which are associated with the actions then set out that we would carry out in our drought plans at those different levels or drought triggers. We are also looking at specifically ensuring that we have environmental drought triggers, which are very early on in a drought event. Ben mentioned earlier environmental drought, which happens before water supply drought. And this is when the environment starts to be affected. So we want to ensure that we have proactive measures in place to ensure that we can, where possible, mitigate environmental impacts of drought before the water supplies become affected. We are then also looking at our communications plans, which are focused around the demand elements of our drought plans to ensure that we can actually reduce demand, which is a crucial element of drought planning. And we're taking on board what is set out in the Environment Agency guidance, and also learning from our experiences of communicating and engaging with our own customers and best practice in the industry as well. So we're also working with the retail wholesaler group as an industry to develop a best practice guide specifically for non-household users and retailers and NAVs to set out how they can best communicate around drought and to ensure that they are aligned with the water companies to reduce any confusion for customers during a drought event. We're also, over the past year, we've been working with WRE on a feasibility study specifically around what information is required to assess the costs and benefits of non-essential use bans, as most companies or many companies have never needed to implement a non-essential use ban. So there is limited information about the impacts of what would happen if a non-essential use ban would be implemented. So we need to be able to assess those costs and benefits. So there's a study happening to work out if we have enough information to carry out that assessment. We are also, the industry is looking at potential new drought permit options. Many companies are investigating whether there are any supply side options that they could use as new drought permits, which aren't already in their plans. And alongside this, looking at any other supply side actions, particularly around extreme and emergency options. And these will probably go in the emergency drought plans, which are going to be new documents being put together specifically around really extreme droughts, the likes of which we have not experienced before. We are also working to improve our drought permit readiness, and this came out of the 2022 event learning, which showed that many companies needed to do more to ensure that their drought permits are ready to take off the shelf, as it were, and submit to the Environment Agency as an application with all the information required ready to ensure that the Environment Agency can determine that application without any delays, which is really crucial, particularly where drought events can happen fairly quickly. You need to be able to implement those drought permits as soon as possible. We are also continuing to work together, both as an industry and through the regional groups to align where we can and share best practice across the industry, as well as with other water users and interested parties. And this webinar today is an example of that. And with our regional groups that we are a part of, we are also putting together statements of intent, which are guided by the guidance and how we work together as regional groups, both in droughts and outside of drought situations. Thanks, Alice. If you could go to the next slide. So we're just each going to talk a little bit about our individual companies in terms of who we are, setting the context a bit for us as a water company, and then going into a bit more detail on the key focus areas for our drought plans as part of this drought planning round. So Affinity Water, we are the largest water-only supply company in England, with 3.9 million customers at latest count. We have 3 distinct company areas, which you should be able to see on the map there, and those are split into 8 different water resource zones. The area which is most relevant for this group is the Drought region, which we refer to as our East region, which is the one in green. And that sits within the WRE area, whereas the rest of our water resource zones sit within the WRSE group area. We are in a supply area which is designated as under serious water stress, which is common with the other water companies in the southeast of England, and that means that the Environment Agency has designated the area as that category. We are predominantly groundwater sourced as a water company, although the ratio is going to shift slightly in our next AMP8, which is our next water resource planning period, and we are going to see a greater reliance on surface water and a bit of a reduction in groundwater supply, particularly for our Drought region, our East region, and this is aimed at alleviating pressures on the local environment. Thanks, Alice. Go to the next slide. So the focus areas for our new drought plan, along with the common areas which I've already talked about, this graph is a kind of graphical representation of our drought plan with the different drought triggers, which go from the drought trigger 1, which is the yellow band, through to drought trigger 4, which is the band in red at the bottom. We also have an environmental stress trigger, which I think all companies are moving towards having as well now, which is that green one at the top. And you might not be able to see the different labels, but those are some of the key actions associated with the different drought triggers in our plan. So some of the key areas for this next drought plan, we're going to be including a new drought trigger specifically for our Drought region, which is going to be a surface water drought trigger, which we have not had before. And this will be due to the increased reliance we will have on the reservoir Ardley. And yeah, that's going to be aligned with Anglian's drought trigger for Ardley as well. So we're working really closely with Anglian around our drought planning. We are updating our drought triggers generally to ensure that they align with our new level of service for our drought permits, which is set out in our WRMP 24, which means that for drought permits, we are going to move to the level of service which is 1 in 200 year. So that means that we aim to be resilient to droughts up to a 1 in 200 year level of severity without the need for drought permits. So we're doing some work around that. We're looking at also putting together any new drought permit options, which specifically we are going to need to require for the Drought region, as I mentioned, with a greater reliance on surface water. And we are also carrying out full environmental assessments for the entirety of our drought plan, which will include habitats regulations assessments and strategic environmental assessments, as well as full environmental assessment reports for each of our drought permit options. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you. So that moves us on to Anglian. Yeah, we are the largest water and wastewater company in England and Wales by geographic area, which is displayed on the map on the right. Supply more than 7 million domestic and non-domestic customers. As has already been mentioned, yeah, kind of the whole of the east of England / south east of England is the Drought region in the UK, and yeah, that was mentioned, the importance of why we focus on drought planning. The way our sources are split, it's roughly 50-50 between surface water and groundwater. So you can see on the map on the right hand side, all of the surface water sources are either indicated by a triangle or a little bucket as a reservoir, and most of those are distributed towards the west of our region, whereas the groundwater is indicated by the little blue dots. And as you can see, quite a lot of East Anglia and Lincolnshire is mainly fed by those groundwater sources. And we have 8 reservoirs, 7 direct intakes from rivers, and over 200 groundwater sources that support the area. And we also manage the water supply within Hartlepool as well, which you can see in the top right of the map. Next slide, Alice. So yeah, what are our focus areas as Anglian? So on top of the kind of summary common focus areas that Annika already mentioned, we were relatively pleased with how our drought plan performed during 2022, but yeah, always room for improvement. And yeah, we're looking at that with considerations for lessons learned and the feedback received that we had from stakeholders. One of the key things for us is that in our latest water resource management plan that we have to align with, our water resource zones have updated. So we're just going to reflect that within our drought plan as well. So that's just how we manage water resources or manage resources and implement actions within each one of those zones. We're looking at integrating new ways of operating the supply system. So many of you may be aware of one of the WRE options, which was building a pipeline from the north of our region down to the south and the east. And with that, we're implementing a new way of kind of managing water supply, and we call that production planning. So we're gonna work through how that would work within a drought scenario as well. We're looking to specifically review and update the drought vulnerable groundwater list that we have. So that sets out the groundwater sites that are most vulnerable to drought within our region. And so we can focus on those or focus on monitoring on those. So we're ready for if they start to get impacted during dry weather. Continue to focus on improving our collaboration with other sectors and non-household users. So we already kind of implement a number of schemes where we share water with other users. So we have a scheme on the Lower Nene, whereby we choose to stop abstracting into Rutland water to allow more water downstream into the Lower Nene from other abstractors such as agriculture and the irrigators. And we're looking to see whether there's any other options that we can do that. And that's also through the WRE drought group as well. We're going to amend our kind of temporary use ban, host ban consultation and representation time, so that's allows us to be more reactive when drought occurs. We're also looking at updating modelling relating to our drought permits, as well as reviewing and updating our monitoring and mitigation plans that are associated with those. During 2022, we created a new water resources and drought team, which is the team that I work within, and we're going to reflect that within the latest plan. So it represents how we manage the structure, and we also implemented a new way of responding to drought as well. So yeah, we have what we call a J-cell structure, which comes from a kind of army military background, and that's how we set out responses to incidents, and we associated that with drought as well. So something we'll be updating within the plan. And we also have a drought management team that sets out and manages our strategy through drought, and that normally only meets during drought, but we now meet twice a year to really understand the current situation and look forward to the risks that we've always got drought in our minds. And then the final bit is we're doing quite a lot of exploring and research with other water companies around the world. So we've had some conversations with Southern Nevada Water Authority and Global Omnium, who operate out of Valencia, and that's to give us a better idea of how they respond to drought, because obviously they're in more extreme and more dry scenarios than we are, what actions they do, what restrictions they implement, so we can understand a bit more about how we can implement those within the kind of England or national context as well. And yeah, also exploring new demand measures such as the seasonal tariffs that are currently being trialled within parts of our region. That's it for me. Thank you. Next slide.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daniel Clark. I'm the Water Resources Manager at Cambridge Water. So a little bit of context around Cambridge Water. We are the smallest water company in the WRE area. We serve around 350,000 customers and supply around 85 million litres of water a day on average. We are unique in that currently our supplies are 100% from groundwater sources in the chalk aquifer. And we also are expecting significant growth, particularly in the surrounding Cambridge area and the A428 corridor, with some very, very large developments in the pipeline. We are classified as an area of water stress and water scarcity. As mentioned earlier, we're in a very dry area with low rainfall, prone to drought, and with increasing demands for water. Whilst groundwater can be resilient in terms of public water supply, we often see environmental impacts earlier in a drought, and these are often seen at sensitive sites. And another fairly unique part of our area of supply is that we have a lot of sensitive chalk streams in the area, over 260 kilometres of chalk-fed water bodies in the catchments that we operate within. And also we have over 100 SSSIs and other designated sensitive sites in our area, which are generally dependent on the groundwater. Next slide, please. So some of the areas that we'd like to focus on, in addition to those already mentioned earlier around the common themes and the requirements of the guidance, is that we would like to build on the environmental triggers in our existing plan by developing these further and exploring the actions that we could take to help the environment, and whether these can be done sooner in a drought sequence. To help this and our overall drought planning, we are going to look at standardising some of our drought indicators. So building on our existing groundwater and effective recharge triggers with more environmental triggers such as river flows and standardised stream flow indexes, which are very good at helping with those environmental stresses within drought. So we'll also be looking at including climate triggers such as precipitation indexes and rainfall and evapotranspiration indexes, which are also very good at providing that early warning of drought and where there's an impending environmental impact. To help with all this, we also want to introduce a drought management dashboard, which will actually help us with our monitoring and our forecasting looking forward as droughts emerge and as they continue, just to understand where the severity might be and help us plan those triggers in advance. A key part of updating the data and the drought triggers will be to review our levels of service, in particular for level 2 restrictions for tubs, or previously known as hosepipe bans. For us at Cambridge Water, these are currently 1 in 20, whereas the other water resources east companies are mostly 1 in 10. So we are looking to see if alignment with the other water companies in the WRE area could be appropriate. We're also looking at updating our communications plan. So, as mentioned earlier in the common themes, we need to enhance how we show how we intend to work with non-households and NAVs to provide clarity and consistency on messaging throughout a drought, and to provide a good framework for these communications. But also we want to look to where we can use more and different innovative channels and approaches for communications, and work with other stakeholders to get the messaging out there and get it consistent and really make it hit home. Also, where applicable, we will develop some of our environmental monitoring plans in more detail to reflect that environmental stress that we're talking about earlier, and also to support any of those decisions that we have to make on changes to abstraction patterns during a drought. That also links into those other options around extreme drought measures, which we'll be looking to develop in more detail, and also consider where drought permits might be applicable to us as a company. At the moment, we have no drought permits, but as things become more tighter in terms of the water available, we will look to where drought permits might be able to support the actions in our drought plan and how we manage changes to abstraction in water during a drought. And next slide.
Over to Liz Corbett. Liz, if you're on mute.
Yeah, apologies for that. Hi. So Essex and Suffolk Water sort of nestles between Anglian Water and Affinity Water. So we're a water-only company supplying 1.8 million customers in our Essex area, and 300,000 approximately in the Norfolk and Suffolk area. So in our Essex area, we supply just under Colchester down to the Thames estuary, and then from the London boroughs of Ilford and Barking out to Southend-on-Sea. And then in the Suffolk area, we supply Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, and then south of that, the Barsham area, and then Eye and Ben Hall, and the East Suffolk coast. In Essex, around half of our water in a drought year is sourced from outside of our supply area. So our key imports are from Thames water to the west of our region, and that comes in as a bulk raw water supply from their Lee Valley reservoirs that are filled by the River Lee. So that's the William Girling and the King George reservoir just to the north east of London. So that water comes into our Chigwell water treatment works and supplies the east of our Essex zone there. Another key transfer for us is through the Ely Ouse to Essex transfer system. This is an Environment Agency owned and operated water transfer system, which diverts water that would flow out to sea through the Wash near King's Lynn, right to the north of the region. It diverts it south instead at Denver. You can just see they're marked on the map just south of King's Lynn, through a variety of natural and man-made channels and pipelines through pumps, etc., into the headwaters of the River Stour. It can then be transferred further on from the River Stour to the River Pant, which is a tributary to the River Blackwater. So through this transfer, we can support our river abstractions. We've got 4 of them along the River Stour, and our abstraction at Langford in Essex also. So we can use the water at the water treatment works, directly feed those water treatment works at Langham and Langford, but we can also store that water in Hanningfield Reservoir and Abberton Reservoir as well. In Suffolk, the region in the far north, or in Norfolk, I suppose we call it, we refer to it as our Suffolk area, but really it's Norfolk and Suffolk. So at Ormsby, there's the Trinity Broads, part of the Norfolk Broads. We can abstract from those broads and the River Bure there, and some local groundwater sources as well, to supply Great Yarmouth. And then we have another treatment works at Lound, just near Lowestoft, that abstracts from a series of lakes, including Fritton Lake near Somerleyton, to supply North Lowestoft. And then coming slightly further south again, we have Barsham Water Treatment Works, which abstracts from the River Waveney, and also some small groundwater sources there. And from Barsham Water Treatment Works, we can supply South Lowestoft and the local area. Coming further south again, where you've got Eye, Silem, Halesworth, Ben Hall area marked on the map there, that's all small groundwater sources supplied by local water treatment works to the area. So we do have our groundwater is particularly resilient in a drought, and because of that external transfer of water into our supply area during a drought, our resources are quite resilient, and we were quite resilient in the 2022 drought that we've been mentioning is our most recent one that we can learn from. We did implement a level 1 during that drought, which is asking our customers to reduce water use where possible and use it very wisely. But we didn't need a level 2 temporary use ban at that time. However, we do have some challenges ahead. Climate change is obviously a big one that impacts us all. Growing non-household demand, particularly in our Eye Suffolk area. We've got a lot of industry developing there. The population growth, again, across the board, we are expecting quite significant growth in our supply areas. And then also abstraction license sustainability reductions. So this is a number of drivers are reducing our abstraction licenses. So these are assessments that are carried out by the Environment Agency under a variety of legislation. So we've got Water Framework Directive, Habitat regulations, and then future reductions to mitigate against future climate change as well. So we have a number of challenges across our areas. Next slide, please. So the key updates for our plan in particular are aligning our levels of service with our recently published water source management plan. So because of the challenges I've just mentioned, we are reducing our levels of service from 1 in 10 years to 1 in 5 years compared to our previous drought plan, which was published in 2022. And a level 2 temporary use ban is now 1 in 10 years rather than 1 in 20 years. So this all depends on the Great British weather, whether these on average frequencies will transpire, but they're what's called our planned levels of service based on our forecast assessments. And that's just due to the water scarcity, increasing demand, etc., that I've described. We'll be reviewing and validating our current drought actions. So we'll be making sure that they are practical and feasible to implement. And with the changing context in how the Environment Agency assessed the sensitivity of some of our sources, some of our current actions may not be acceptable. So if we came to applying for a permit, for example, then it may be that now the Environment Agency wouldn't support that. So we need to liaise with them through pre-consultation, which is the period we're in now for our new drought plan, and ensure that the actions that we are going to include in our new drought plan are going to be feasible and actionable. And a key one for us is updating our strategic environmental assessment of our plan and the habitats regulations assessment as well. So they're specific assessments that we do to identify potential environmental impact of our drought actions, how we might be able to prevent, avoid and mitigate those actions and recover from them after we might have to implement them. That's it from me. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Liz. Just before I head back into the role of regional groups and all this, just a reminder, there are some questions coming in on the Q&A. There's been a couple of comments in the chat, so please feel free as we come towards the end of the webinar to post any questions you'd like to raise. And there might also be a function at the end where we can switch off some microphones and allow people to ask more questions. But just to bring it back to where we are in terms of regional planning and the role of regional groups. The role of regional groups like Water Resources East continues to develop, and while to date the focus has been on the development of the longer term regional water resources plans and how they link up with company long-term planning and raising the profile of challenge to other water using sectors across the region. The opportunity for regional groups to play this role to help groups and organisations come together to solve challenges that sit outside of that long-term plan development process is definitely gaining traction. Working together more proactively and tactically during a drought, whether that's environmental drought, agricultural, water supply drought, and during dry weather is obviously a key example of that. And that's why the updated national framework for water resources and the drought guidance released recently by the Environment Agency is alluding to the fact that there'll be this expectation that regional groups will develop, working with water companies and their respective drought groups, a statement of intent that sets out the intention of how we will work collectively on the management and communication integration of work around droughts. I think it's important to realise that we all work as and manage water and use water system, whether that's the kind of things that the reps from water companies have been describing, sharing water resources within and between interconnected systems for water company planning, or whether this is about different water users across different sectors sharing information and figuring out how to optimize water resources allocation between groups and manage droughts and developing droughts together. And it was exactly the need to create a forum for that kind of integration that drove the WRE Drought Group to be formed in 2022, or in response to the 2022 drought. And what that drought group, which is a multi-sector group with representation across the regulators, so the Environment Agency and DEFRA, plus the Consumer Council for Water, plus invited members from the energy sector, the agricultural sector, navigation, and for WRE member water companies. It creates that space, that forum to discuss tactical and proactive solutions that might help better allocate and optimize the way we're mitigating and managing a developing drought as and when needed. And it will be through that drought group that we'll look forward to developing that statement of intent as part of our offer into this planning process as we go through the next couple of years. So with that being said, I'm going to hand over to Vicky Lemon to take us through some next steps and what's happening next before we head into a bit of a QA.
Thanks, Ben. So Victoria from Cambridge Water, just wrapping up everything we've been through before we move into that Q&A piece. So we do currently have drought plans which were published 22-23. They are available on all of our websites, so please do go and have a look at them, get to understand what it is we have historically published. That is the piece that we did our sort of pre-consultation on. So as mentioned previously, most of those are now closed, but if you do have any further comments, you can reach out. We've got our contact details on the last slide. There is also the National Drought Framework that the EA published. That again is consultation is closed for that, but the report is there. So if you are interested in understanding what the Environment Agency are expecting of us, then you can go and have a read of that. And I just wanted to recap then on our drought plan process. So as the pre-consultation is closed, please do contact us though if you have any further to say. We're now going into a development phase. So we have got until the 6th of October to publish our draft plan. So we'll be working through that over the next few months, and that will then go out to consultation over winter. So there will be plenty of opportunity to have your thoughts shared with us, and we look forward to hearing what you think and how we can build those in. And just to finish though, just really that whilst the drought plan is a very important piece that we have to put in place, we don't just think about drought and how to use water wisely when we're in a drought situation. It's something that as water companies is business as usual for us, and we do try and maintain ongoing drought protection throughout our day-to-day functionality of what we're doing. So we really promote water efficiency messaging. We have campaigns. We strive for strong leakage management and like running a very optimal system. Water efficiency, you've probably heard us talk about quite a lot. We really do promote that customers use their water wisely to support the environment, and we have a range of methods and measures to do that. And all of the water companies have got ideas and tips on their website. So if you would like to go and have a look at that, or we can share separate links if that would be interested for you, to help doing your bit as well to making sure that we're protecting the environment on a day-to-day rather than just when we're in a drought condition. And that's that. And I think I'm going to, Ben, is it for Q&A?
Yep. Thank you very much, Vicky. And just to apologise, it's Vicky Thatcher. I might have said Vicky Lemon before. So yes, thank you, Vicky Thatcher. All right, if I could ask the speakers to be poised, perhaps turn cameras back on if necessary to go into a bit of the Q&A. I'm really glad there are some questions here. It's quite a mix. So I think what might be worth touching on initially is just to clarify where we start to talk about boundaries and regionals and areas. And there's some comments in the chat that just look to ensure that we're joining things up between regions. So I'm wondering whether Dan Clark, you might better just just explain how we are dealing with abstractions and water management issues that span what might be a water company boundary, but actually on a natural catchment or a groundwater catchment basis do actually get picked up. Dan, could I ask you to field that question?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is some of the transfers that are planned in the area. So across all the Water Resources East companies, we do consider where we could share options that are not necessarily within our own area of supply, but we can support other companies. So in particular for Cambridge Water, we within our WRE, which will be published shortly, we are considering transfers in from Anglian Water's area of supply, and in future, obviously developing, which I think most people have heard of, the Fens Reservoir, which is a shared reservoir scheme with Anglian Water, which will supply both us and Anglian Water's customers in the future. And these bigger schemes are in addition to sort of smaller existing schemes where we have already for cross-border supplies. So some of them operate on a regular basis, but some of those are called upon more regularly or more frequently when we have dry periods or emergency situations. So there's a lot of transfer of resources that already goes on, and even more of that is planned within the region.
Thanks, Dan. And I think Jenny, who initially posed a question on a similar theme, might like to come back. Al, is it possible to unmute Jenny so that Jenny can ask?
Yeah, I'll have a go now.
Hi, sorry, just
Hi, Jenny. Should be able to speak.
was that meant to be answering my question, or was that a different question? Sorry, because mine was more.
Yeah, I think from a slightly different angle. So you're referring to groundwater abstractions. Would you like to just clarify and repose that question verbally?
I can do it. It's just that I was just interested in Annika, the affinity water abstractions in the Stort and the Lee that cover both that they're actually in the Water Resources East patch, even though they're in, not considered also in Water Resources South East, Annika. So I just don't know how those have been taken into account, because obviously for modelling they're in the Water Resources East area when you look at catchment modelling. However, they're mostly, you're saying they're taken into account more in Water Resources South East. So I just wanted to understand. So I've not posed it very well.
Thanks, Jenny. That makes sense to me. Annika, would you like to come back on that one?
Yeah, sorry, I'm still a little bit confused, Jenny. In terms of what modelling specifically are you referring to? Because obviously we do carry out our WINEP investigations for our groundwater abstractions, and they are irrespective of whether they're in WRE or WRSC, they take into account the catchments and any associated impacts on those groundwater catchments.
Just thinking about the modelling that was done for Water Resources East for sustainability reductions in the BAU plus modelling. Obviously, these are in the Water Resources East area because of the flowing into the north. However, are they taken into account in terms of modelling, in terms of abstraction reductions, and within the Water Resources South East plan, because they're in the Lee and Stort or in the Water Resources East plan?
Yeah, okay, I can probably feel this a little bit better. So I mean, just initially to clarify, when it comes to understanding longer term changes to abstraction regimes across our catchments, which might include changes to groundwater abstractions to improve river base flows and things like that, particularly in some of the catchments you note in your comment, the Cam and the Ivor, that these things tend to land more into the water resource management planning process and the longer term regional planning process. So these are long term objectives which maybe have short term actions along that pathway, and that's in contrast to what the drought planning process is about, which is the tactical response to a drought event. So just to kind of reiterate that distinction there, but I guess I can just simply reassure you that we do work together, and Affinity Water being the company that spans the catchments you're referring to, when assessments are carried out where a catchment spans a regional boundary or a company boundary, they're all taken into account. We're all using common data sets driven by the same processes and assumptions. So we do very much speak to each other on those kind of planning processes. So I guess I can just reassure you that that's the case, and we'll continue to do that into the next planning round.
I want to come up all the time in this meeting, but I'd just like to say that in terms of the way Water Resources East and Water Resources South East looked at the cuts in the BAU plus and the BAU plus was quite different. That's why the question, but I want to get any more time on this.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Jane. All right, so back into the Q&A, and reminder that people can thumbs up on some questions. So into some of the nitty gritty about drought planning and drought terminology, just so that we're all on the same page. Can I just pose a question to Dan Hawke, just to explain again for the listeners what a rotor cut is, and then perhaps also to touch on the question around how high levels of population and housing growth within the region set out by the new government might be set in the context of the development of these drought plans.
Yeah, that's fine. So a rotor cut, I suppose the best way of describing it is that you'd only receive water for portions of the day. So it's you during a 24-hour period. For example, if we were in emergency situations, there was not much water to go around, we could implement pressure reduction valves that we have throughout our system, and they would restrict the amount of water that would be coming to customer houses. So we could set the system up, for example, so that you had water for 4 or 5 hours in the morning, then you wouldn't have any water during the middle of the day, and then 4 or 5 hours during the afternoon to try and restrict the amount of water that was being taken from the water resources. Obviously, I must say they're in level 4 for a reason. These are emergency restrictions that, the last time they were used in that sort of area would have been 1976, at least from our perspective. So we would never want to be able to do that, but that's what a rota cut means. And then the demand question about housing and growth, I think a few people on the call mentioned this is obviously a big challenge for the East of England, one of the fastest growing regions outside of London. And basically that is managed through our water resource management planning process that Liz touched on at the start. So as part of creating our water resource management plans, we have to set out the population growth and the expected demand that we would expect within the area over the next 25 to 50 years. And that demand information is taken from the government plans, also the council plans, and all put together to understand what demand and number of people would expect in each water resource zone. And then the idea of the water resource management plan is that you set out the supply actions to make sure that there is no deficit when you balance those two together. So you invest in things like reservoirs, or on the demand side, you could go further on smart metering or leakage management to make sure that you're balancing that increased demand. So that's all taken into account as part of the water resource management plan process. And then the drought planning process specifically just acts within the year with the assets and the actions already set out with the water resource management plans.
Thanks, Dan. For the next question, Al, would you mind flicking back to slide number 8, please, which is a slide titled "What's included in the drought plan?" And Dan, while you're unmiked, Dan Hawke, I'll ask you to field this one. There was a question raised just for clarity. Could you explain, please, the distinction in how the drought status versus the drought levels is used, and the terminology between what the Environment Agency might release nationally versus what water companies might be dealing with, please?
So Rob noted the question about where this table comes from. So I should have mentioned this when I went through the slide. This is taken from the Environment Agency's guidance. So this is their suggestions on the type of actions that us as water companies should be considering at each level. So obviously we would look to align with this, but within each area we might have specific actions that we would do at certain levels. But in general, these are the types of actions that we would be considering at each level. As Ben mentioned, there's 2 columns on the left-hand side here. The drought level, so the second column, that's something that's kind of more relating to kind of water companies. So we would determine we are at a certain level status due to the water resources that we had available within a certain water resource zone. However, the drought status on the left is more of an indication of the type of conditions you would be expecting at that level. And this is where some of the confusion sometimes comes within drought, whereas the Environment Agency have a job to assess the entire catchment, entire area, to understand from an environmental point of view, from an abstraction point of view, from a recreational point of view, and a water resource point of view, what the current status is. And then from the map that I think was on Ben's slide earlier on, where it said it's the drought status, they would then determine a catchment to be in prolonged dry weather or drought or severe drought. But the confusion sometimes comes when the Environment Agency may determine a catchment to be in drought. That doesn't always mean as a water company we'll be implementing level 2 actions, because as Ben mentioned at the start, we've invested in resilience, and we're a bit more resilient to potentially those initial impacts that are being felt. Not saying we won't be doing any actions, because obviously we'll be making sure that we're mitigating the amount of water we use at any point of the year. So the thing from water companies, we focus on the drought level status in the second column, and then the first column is more about the general understanding of the current environment situation as it stands.
Thanks, Dan. Hopefully that's clear to everyone. While we're on the subject of drought triggers, Liz Corbett, can I bring you on this one? John Gibson's questions about changes to drought triggers and whether there's any intention to align those changes between companies and nationally. You got any views on that, Liz?
Yeah, so as part of the guidelines, we are asked to align with our neighbouring water companies, particularly if we have things like water transfers, so whether that's raw untreated water or potable water transfers. Obviously we can't be planning to be receiving that water when the other company may not be able to provide that water in a drought. So we need to look at those individual drought actions that might impact our neighbouring water companies or regionally. So we'll be doing that as part of our review of our actions, and as part of that, the triggers to start considering them will be reviewed. So when we say triggers, it not necessarily hard and fast, right? We've dropped to a certain level in a reservoir, therefore we will enact this as part of the drought management group that's set up during a drought within each water company, that has representatives of the various internal stakeholders that we need as part of a drought response. We would look at the state of our resources as things start to become drier, and then formally in the drought as the EA status describes it. And then we would look at our drought plan options and consider which were appropriate for that particular drought. So the nature of droughts can change and vary between years. You might get very dry spring, hot dry spring, and then the summer is wetter. You might have a wet spring and then a very long dry summer, a dry autumn into the winter, and then the different nature of those droughts impacts different types of resources in different ways. So as each company has described their water resources, some are solely groundwater dependent. Like us, we have that external import of water from almost a different region of the country. So it wouldn't necessarily be that our triggers will align perfectly to each other, but from a communications perspective, under the WRE drought group, we will always look to align messaging to customers so that we don't certainly confuse them. Obviously, we all it's like a jigsaw, isn't it, around the Anglian region, which company is covering which. And then it gets even more confusing because some water companies operate in the same areas as others. Some do water, some do sewerage. So we have to make sure that we're not confusing our customers by giving slightly different messages at different times. So we'll align our actions definitely under the WRE banner as such. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, sounds good to me, Liz. And while we're on the subject of triggers, and I liked your point about saying a lot of these triggers aren't, hard and fast. It's about understanding what the wider context is. Our very own Daniel Johns from Water Resources East posed a question based on how much he liked Annika, your slide 13. If Al, you wouldn't mind migrating back to slide 13 for people to see. Daniel's asked how possible it is, or what's out there around publishing this kind of data in near real time, and not necessarily just retrospectively, to help with public engagement or to have a wider understanding of how close we are to some of those triggers.
Yeah, we do publish our groundwater water resource levels and update them monthly on our website, and I'm happy I can respond to Daniel's comment with a link to that if that's helpful. And we obviously ramp up communications around those water resource levels as we start to go into a drought event, to ensure we take our customers and stakeholders on that journey of letting them know when risks do start to increase.
That's great. It's already there, Daniel. Anyone from one of the other companies want to kind of build on that? Is any of the other companies sharing that kind of information, or would they want people to be pointed towards different sources?
Just to come in for Cambridge Water, we do exactly the same. It's a slightly simplified version of the actual triggers graphic that's displayed there, but we give an indication of drought status at least on a monthly basis, and that becomes more frequent as we are entering a dry period.
Same for Essex and Suffolk Water. We have information on our website about our drought status, whether it's normal, drier than average, etc. We have that on our website, and then we also have a link to water source, which is an online platform, a geographical map platform, where ourselves, Anglian Water, and Hartlepool Water in the northern region as well have some information on there about our drought status. So I can post a link to that in the will people see it in the Q&A? I'm not sure.
I think
We'll
if you put
provide
it,
a link to that.
Anika's just put the link to the Affinity Water in the Q&A, but I think it
Yep.
might be worth us, before we share the slides, or if there's any subsequent communications around this, maybe we can make sure that those links are embedded with any products we do, so we can the team can follow up on that after this call and see if we can make that more widely available. Thank you. So moving away from data and triggers, something a bit more about how people are working together. Lindsay Hargreaves, who's actually our agricultural representative on the Water Resources East board, has articulated that it's encouraging to learn that there's an interest in learning about and the concerns of other sectors and interested parties. But I wonder if anyone on the panel would be open to giving any kind of real life examples of how actions on the ground during the development of a drought of different types actually plays out, and whether we think those kind of activities might increase in frequency as we move into the future. Might put Liz on the spot again, because I know that you do work really closely across different sectors.
Yeah, I guess it's all about communication with all the different sectors. So for us in our area, the key one is that industry, particularly in the Suffolk, Hartismere area. We're already communicating with them off the back of our WMP24, where we're having to invest in new resources to ensure that 1 in 500 year resilience into the future. So the lines of communication are already open, between ourselves and also via WRE with the various stakeholders there. So on the ground, during a drought, it is all about that communications plan. So we'll be reviewing and refining that, particularly taking into account the new requirements to communicate with NAVs through our wholesale. So water companies are considered wholesale providers of water, and then we have our retail organisations that are the interface between us and our business customers. So we have to ensure that our communications are very effective with the retailers, water retailers, and that their communications are then effective with business users of water. So the communications is the key aspect through drought, ensuring that the customers are aware of what might be coming up, so that sort of look forwards to, or it's getting very dry, and if it doesn't rain, we may be looking at restrictions. So be prepared, and that's particularly key for businesses as well if they're reliant on water for processing, etc. So a forward look preparation, so that it's not a surprise to them when we suddenly need to ask them to reduce their water use. And a key thing in the guidance this time is also coming out of a drought, so making sure that your communications are effective to say, we're in a good position now, our resources have recovered, and you can start to use water more normally as you would do. So yeah, it's all about communication essentially then.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just build on that. We can't preempt exactly what this statement of intent for how regional groups and everyone's going to work together, but we did have like nice examples in the last period of dry weather, where there were genuine efforts across water companies and other sectors to explore how water that could be made available for kind of interim periods could have been released. So I think the existence of the WRE Drought Group facilitates those kind of conversations. And I guess I'd just like to reiterate that as different groups, organizations, sectors become more aware and more organized in how they manage their own water demand and their own water resources management practices, I think it means that we can more strongly say that, it's not our place as WRE or water companies' place to make a plan for everyone around them in other sectors, but we need to make sure we're all very open to working together and sharing those plans as they come together. And I think that agriculture is a good example where there are groups of farmers and businesses coming together to understand their needs as we approach a period of stress, of dry weather and drought, whatever that means to the sector in question, and making sure we're able to share those needs, share potential mitigation, share potential actions across those boundaries. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to working on that challenge collectively.
And
So while
just,
we're on
I just-
engagement, oh sorry, Dan, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I was just going to add in terms of just trying to pick out some of the things that are actually happening in practice on that, because like you say, something we're focusing on, but I suppose some examples that we have currently whereby we have certain licenses in Anglian that we share with other abstractors. And I think going forward, some areas of interest, every time we build or create a new source of water, the reservoirs being a key one, obviously we think about the wider resource impact, whether that be through flooding or be through other abstractors potentially utilising that water. And there's another area as well with water reuse, where we're looking at to understand, can we utilise some of that reused or treated effluent from our water recycling centres to be used as another water source for other users. So it's definitely being looked at, and for all new options going forward, that's something that we're aware of. I think the Water Sources Drought Group is just trying to understand how we can help and support sectors with the water we have currently available, which Lindsay knows is not much due to the license conditions that we have, but something we need to take into account with more flexible licensing going forward where appropriate.
Yeah, sounds great, Dan. And Dan, I was actually going to come to you next anyway, while we're on the subject of kind of collaboration and consultation. You had the timeline of the consultation happening, public consultation in the winter coming. But there was a question here, I can't find it right now, but about how and whether there's going to be any focused liaison with local resilience forums and others as these draft drought plans come together, to encourage that multi-agency response. Is there any plans to do any more focused consultation?
Yes, I mean, us in Anglian, we sent pre-consultation letters to all of the local resilience forums within the Anglian region. We received a couple of responses from them, which is really interesting. We'll take those thoughts into account. We also actually attended one of the local resilience forum meetings in Milton Keynes last week to talk to the team a bit more about what drought planning is and how we would look to align with them. I suppose the key things areas of alignment for me is understanding the best time to bring local resilience forums into the drought management sphere. So communication at any point is really good to understand the current situation, but at what point through those drought level status you saw on the table would be the best point to bring those teams in. And in most cases, the more severe the scenario, obviously, the more interest there will be from the LRF. So, I think there's more work to be done to understand exactly how we would work together in that multi-agency approach. And like Annika mentioned, some of those more severe actions have never been tested within this region. So I think, maybe some resilience exercises or things like that are something that we could all look to support and work through ahead of that time. So, we at Anglian certainly started that consultation process, but I think there's more that we can all do to understand how we would enact some of these more severe measures.
Thanks, Dan. Dan Clark, I'll bring you in on this one. There's a question that perhaps again overlaps between the drought response and longer term water resources planning, hence me asking you. There's a question from Sally Noble about how growing demand and growth in the region, and obviously Cambridge is one of those areas, how that's playing into our thinking around water dependent habitats and how impacts are going to be mitigated. So I guess I'll ask you to touch on perhaps how that's being dealt with through the long-term water resource planning process, in contrast to then how we mitigate for environmental impacts during a drought situation as part of the drought planning process.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. So the long-term impact of growth is really dealt with in our WRMPs, water resource management plans. So they look at forecasting that demand we expect over the long term, 25 years as a minimum, and understanding that impact. And as part of those WRMPs, we also include the inputs and outputs from our water resources, our water industry national environment programme, where we look at environmental impacts and we plan reductions to our existing sources, so that we can protect the environment into the future. And those are incorporated into our plans, and they generally generate the need for new supply options and increased demand management options, and they're the kind of things that we include in our water resources plans, so that we ensure that the growth does not have more of an impact on the environment in the future. And then as we go into a drought period, then obviously there can be increased impacts on top of what the growth has been mitigated for, and that's what the drought plans look at. So drought permits and drought monitoring is very key and critical to understanding where those impacts might be exacerbated during a drought, and what we can do so that we can ensure that we continue to supply water during a drought, but also make sure that the impacts of supplying that water during a drought are mitigated. And we have those different measures in our drought plans above and beyond what's in our water resources plans to do that. But it's also probably worth saying that as we go through the water resource management plan process, we are becoming more and more resilient to drought by enhancing the options that we put in. So they are going above and beyond what we need for just the growth.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for that answer to the question. I mean, just before we move on, I'll just leave a space in case any of the other water company reps want to build on that from a monitoring and mitigation perspective, but feel free to consider that Dan's answered that one. Okay. Right. There's also a couple of questions again that oh, thanks, Dan. There was a question about the Fens Reservoir. I see, Dan, you've already shared the link to the Fens Reservoir dedicated consultation website, so thank you for that. So if anyone's wondering about a specific scheme reference there, you can follow the link that's in the Q&A that Dan just provided. Can I just touch on the one final question that we haven't dealt with as we approach 11:30 is another one from Lindsay Hargreaves around sharing information and keeping information out of the public domain. Dan Hawke, can I put you on the spot and consider that question, see how we might look to release stuff in a more public friendly, stakeholder friendly way to make sure decisions are transparent and open?
Yeah, so I think the main, just to touch on the reason why the emergency drought plans and our incident plans are not in the public domain is there's a number of reasons. The main one is due to kind of the SMD requirements that we have, because they note specific site locations and sites of the critical national infrastructure. So anything that enters a location that can't be shared externally. There is also obviously plans with vulnerable customers or vulnerable users included within those plans, and that can't be shared for obvious reasons. However, Ben's point, I'm sure Lindsay, your point as well, is clear that there's definitely a summarised version or an idea of what is included within that can be shared. And I think that's what, as water companies, we're trying to work through this next round of planning, is how do we make that a bit more clear. And the Environment Agency are currently developing guidance on this, and we're due to have a bit of a workshop, I think sometime in February, to discuss this in more detail and take a lot of the lessons learned from South West Water from 2022, where they probably were impacted the most from the dry weather in the Cornwall and Devon area. So I think, there's definitely information that cannot be shared as part of those plans due to kind of legal obligations, but there is a way of sharing that information in a maybe more summarised format to understand the sort of things that we would be thinking about, and that's something as water companies we need to develop.
Thanks, Dan. All right, looking down the Q&A and the chat, I feel like the panel have done a pretty good job of covering all the themes that are picked up by various people there. I'm just going to give just another few seconds, another minute or so, just to make sure that nobody has a burning question that they don't feel got answered, or they felt wasn't an adequate response during the Q&A. You should also be able to raise your hand at this point if you would like to verbally ask a question, and I'll ask Al to make sure you're able to unmute and pose your question. With that, I can see Sally Noble, your hand is up. Al, would you mind unmuting Sally for us, please? Hi, Sally.
Oh, hi. Hello. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at the information on the Q&A. I can't see the link for the information about the reservoir. I may be looking in the wrong place. That wasn't the weekly water source one, was it? That was the drought map. Am I getting confused?
No. Dan, would you mind copying the link into the chat, and then it's more easily visible to to those that might not easily be able to skim through the comments that follow on
Yeah.
from individual Q&As.
It should be. I put it in the chat there for you, Sally. But if you Google Fens Reservoir or South Links Reservoir, they're the two reservoirs being produced by Anglian. Then yeah, there's a website there that explains in more detail.
Lovely. Thanks very much. Thank you.
And if anyone's interested in any other schemes, major schemes that form part of the regional plan, our WRE progress report on our regional plan was published last week, and there's nice little summaries of key options that featured in there and with relevant links. So find your way to that via the wre.org.uk website. We've got a hand up from John Gibson. John.
Hi there. Thank you for that. Yes, I posed the question about drought triggers. Thank you, Liz. That was a useful explanation. I was thinking too also in terms of how a NAV, of which I'm part, has to mirror the incumbents' drought plans and drought triggers in terms of communication with customers, the application of temporary use bans, non-essential use bans, and all the rest of it. Now, my concern here was, I suppose, that as we operate across the country, if we start seeing different groups starting to apply changes to those drought triggers, rather than say 1 to 4, you have 1 to 5 or 1 to 3A, 3B, it's going to make it that much more difficult to ensure that our drought plans actually mirror those requirements. So that's kind of where I was going with the question.
Okay, I think there's a distinction between triggers and then those levels. So the levels are quite aligned nationally. So you'll find that level 1 across the board will be customer appeals for restraint. Level 2 is temporary use, etc. Level 3 is the non-essential use bans. By triggers, we mean the things that we will monitor, how we will monitor resources to know when we're going to need an action. So a good example, we've got 2 large pump storage reservoirs in Essex, in Abberton and Hanningfield. We have derived some curves. So if you can imagine a graph with the reservoir level plotted on each week, and then we have a curve plotted on top of that graph. If the reservoir level drops below that curve, then we know we need to start thinking about bringing in the extra resources, as I mentioned, through the ELIO system. And as that drops further, it will go through more curves, more sort of trigger lines to bring in more resources or trigger the demand actions. So if anyone's got a groundwater example, it might be that the groundwater level in one of the observation boreholes. So you have your production borehole where you're pumping your water out into your treatment works. You might have a series of what's called observation boreholes, which aren't influenced by the abstraction pumping, and they're giving you an indication of kind of like the health of that groundwater aquifer, that water body. If that level is dropping, then you might need to start putting on your demand restrictions. So you might have a groundwater level trigger point, so at which the groundwater level will drop below that point, and then that might trigger your consideration to put on your level 1 appeal for restraint. So the triggers are distinctive and specific to a particular source of water, and are kind of different for each source and each company, depending on that. The levels, the actions are slightly different, and they're more or less nationally aligned as far as I'm aware. I don't think I quite answered your question the first time around, but I understand it now.
Okay, no, that's down to me, the way I posed it. Thank you very much for that.
Does that
That's
help?
encouraging. Yes, it does. I was just suddenly having visions of having to have a drought plan this year, which has multiple different trigger levels for communications and so forth. No, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, John. Right, let me just see if there's any other hands up here. In the meantime, there's a kind of side interesting question from Charlotte Stannard about whether water companies offer incentives on their bills for those that have water butts and things like that. Something she's seen in various parts of the region. But I know it's perhaps a side point to the tactical nature of drought planning, but is anyone across the water companies aware of any schemes like that?
I think that for us, it changes over time. So I think, like Vicky said, that on our website, which we can probably share the link to, there's lots of water efficiency communications and messaging on there, which may include packs that we're currently offering, whether it be saving water in the showers or areas like that. But a lot of our campaigns evolve over time. So there's the latest information would be on our website for what's available. But as you say, water butts have been offered in the past, or at least a discount on them from certain retailers, but I'm not aware that Anglian are currently offering that, but there are other mechanisms on our website.
It translates into a bill reduction factor if you have lots of water butts and things like that. Yeah. Les, did you want to come back on any of that?
Just on that, it's not specifically related to your bill. It's more just a discount through the purchasing of the item. I don't think we ever do it against the bill itself.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'll post a link to our water efficiency page on our website for customers and businesses.
Yeah. Interesting thought though, isn't it? And whether as at some point in the future with better monitoring, more dynamic management, whether there could actually be live and smart metering becoming more prevalent across the region, whether there could be any sort of live bill incentive. I know in the energy sector this is happening. I get notified when I could save money by using less than I would have ordinarily if the network is particularly ungreen at that time. So yeah, very, very data dependent, but yeah, nice idea.
Just jump in there then. I think also we are looking at innovative tariffs. So although we don't have them yet, but potentially in the future, and we've got a trial going on in our South Staffs area for lower income families who use less water. There is an incentive there, but there might be a sort of a wider spread change on tariffs to encourage more water efficiency.
Yeah, and the same for Anglian. We currently have a seasonal tariff trial within Colchester, Norwich and Lincoln, I think, are the areas which are based on usage of water for smart meters. And we're looking to roll that out to more places over the next 4 or 5 years. And I'm aware that Affinity are also trialling what was called a rising block tariff trial at the moment as well. So something that all water companies are going to be looking at over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and again, if there's any publicly available web pages that are useful for people to look out off the back of those comments, feel free to pop them in the Q&A or chat, guys. That's useful. Right, well, it looks like the audience is satisfied that questions have been answered. So what I'll probably look to do is draw us to a close. I'll thank our speakers from across the companies. Really, really informative. I know that I've even learned a lot as we've been pulling this webinar together. Hopefully the next steps that were outlined by Vicky and Dan in that timeline are relatively clear, but the contacts for each water company and ourselves are on the slide that you can see on the screen right now. So thank you very much for the panel's engagement, and thank you very much to the close to 70 people we've had listening in across a wide range of organisations and interests. So hopefully you've all found it useful, and as we said at the start, this recording will be published on our website, and we'll look to incorporate any of the additional links into any subsequent comms we send around. But with that, call it a day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.